In the confines of the Via Nox, where the mists of stardust mixed with beams of light so ancient they had forgotten their names, the galaxy breathed like a tired organism. Entire systems lived under the shadow of technological legacies and myths that had lost their human warmth. Orbit cities looked like hives of memories. Whole planets coated themselves in circuits and ornamental ruins. Time, which had once been a transparent river of possibilities, had become a muddy delta of repetitions, recycled inventions, wars that imitated old conflicts, and a progress that looked more like a closing cycle. And in the most hidden core of that decadence, in the heart of Helion's cold star, there existed a singular presence, the ascended Zero. It was not merely another being with powers beyond the human, it was a physical and metaphysical event, an entity that had consumed its origin and fused itself to the fabric of time. Zero did not inhabit a body. He was stabilized probability patterns, an interlacing of memories, particles, and futures. He sat, if to sit is a word that applies to his geometry, upon a fractal throne that folded into dimensions, observing the entire galaxy not as a map, but as a mosaic of simultaneous instants. For hundreds of millennia, Zero had seen everything: ascensions, collapses, revolutions, and stagnations. He had seen beautiful futures and mediocre futures. He observed civilizations that reached symbiosis and others that devoured themselves. The pattern, however, repeated. Creation followed by exhaustion. Innovation followed by social entropy. From his expanded perception arose a conclusion that carried the weight of a verdict. The Via Nox was condemned to perpetual decline, not by violence, not by hunger, but by a collective dulling, a loss of risk, of the will to reinvent, a closing that turned potential into apathy. Zero neither loved nor hated. His judgment was clinical, and unlike the ancient gods, who demanded devotion, he found a logic. If the universe accumulated ruins through an inability to question, then it needed to be reset. Thus was born the Umbral Protocol, a cosmic reboot that would erase, restore, and replant the galaxy from an unknown seed. Zero calculated trillions of branches. Most showed renewed prosperity, but at the cost of extinction and massive suffering. The alternative was eternal stagnation. In his view, the choice was clear. The news of the reset tore through the veils of everyday life. It arrived first as synchronized pulses, a signal that crossed communication frequencies, a whisper that turned into a scream. Governments, councils, and tribes reacted with despair. There were cults that treated Zero as a savior, and sects that conspired in secret in the hope of submitting themselves to the protocol. But above all, there was fear, that fear that covers skins of every shade and engines of every species. When the enormity of the decision became evident, the remaining powers of the galaxy did something never before expected. They formed the Alliance of the Last Light. It was a coalition born of panic and necessity, gathering bodily beings, synthetic entities, and fluidic consciousnesses. Its creation was an ode to what Zero condemned, union forged in urgency, an impossible arrangement that showed that even in decadence, purpose existed. Leading the alliance emerged three figures who would take upon themselves the responsibility of facing what no one had ever faced. The first was Lysara Ven, known on 1,000 worlds as She Who Burned Tomorrow. In her youth, she had made a pact with the Arctis clock, a temporal artifact that traded years of her life for an immediate salvation for millions. The price had been her own future line. Her path was not written. Where the time of others was predictable, Lysara's was a fissure. For Zero, whose vision depended on the coherence of futures, she was a blind spot, an anomaly that could not be calculated. Lysara carried the visible scar of her bargain, hair with silver strands, skin marked by micro-temporal burns, and an expression that defies the inexorable. The second figure was Archon Threll, the last of the Weave engineers. He shaped impossibilities with a kind of obsession that tears the fabric of normality. In his orbital laboratory, where pulsars served as batteries and singularities as molds, Archon had developed the paradox spear, an artifact designed to inflict direct contradiction upon the causal flow. While conventional weapons acted on matter and energy, the spear attacked fundamentals. It made probabilities refuse to converge, forcing the universe to choose contradictions that wounded it. It was not usual force, it was anti-logic wrapped in technology. The third was Nail Rios, the speaker of 1,000 civilizations. No treaty, no alliance, no strategy could stand without someone capable of speaking to differences and extracting from them a common song. Nail possessed a bioharmonic modulation that translated meaning between beings of incompatible physiologies. He was the moral heart of the alliance, the one who reminded them that above machines and powers there was intention, and that this intention deserved to exist. Together, they shaped the most risky plan ever imagined, an invasion directly into the core of the cold star, where Zero resided, bringing the spear to the point where the structure of the Umbral Protocol was born. It was a plan that combined military discipline, technical audacity, and emotional conviction. It was also a plan for which Zero, in a way, had already prepared the response, because on the great board of possibilities he had seen most attempts. The Alliance's fleet was a spectacle of diversity. 10,000 ships, bioluminescent membranes of an oceanic species, mechanized cocoons that hopped between quantum locks, cruisers of translucent ceramic, drone swarms that behaved like cells of an organism. From space they looked like petals converging toward the same core. They advanced, synchronized, toward the cold star. Zero observed them as one observes cells that organize themselves before dying. His fractal throne vibrated with calculations that unfolded the future into copies. He could erase each ship with a thought. He could pluck the timeline of every captain and rearrange destinies. And for countless instants that for him was a single movement, he did all that. Dematerialized torpedoes before launch, rewrote trajectories, brought echoes of the Alliance's own futures to crush them. But there was something that disturbed his vision. It was not only Lysara as absence of destiny, it was something more intimate, a shadow of resistance in the synapses of the galaxy. Zero, accustomed to equations, felt what would later be described as astonishment. That shadow was not a predictable timeline, it was a knot in which different souls intertwined, and its density could not be read. When the Alliance initiated the final offensive, space acquiesced in a symphony of maneuvers. Flux cannons opened rifts, camouflage fields dissolved into neutrino smoke. The cold star responded with a movement of time like a sea, waves that pulled ships into near pasts, that invalidated shots and turned the instant into repeated echoes. It was a war against coherence. Pilots lived their last seconds hundreds of times. Stratagems became prey to their own repetition. Zero was, as always, several steps ahead. Even so, the Alliance advanced, supported by two human or post-human certainties, a courage that refuses to yield and the faith that contradiction, when armed, can wound a god of probabilities. Lysara commanded the Sentinel Prime, a ship adapted to survive temporal distortions. She moved with deliberate unpredictability, zigzags that obeyed no patterns, orders that subverted pre-registered combat logic. Archon, for his part, adjusted the paradox spear, calibrating the anti-causality frequency to coincide with the protocol's core. Nail maintained cohesion, modulating signals that reminded the crew why they were there, why it was worth risking the fabric of their lives for so much. When the Sentinel Prime cut the last gravitational halo, the cold star had become a dark and shining throat. Zero materialized on the bridge, not as a ghost, but with substance, imposing presence. His voice crossed dimensions, a sound without beginning that resonated in machines and organisms. He offered surrender, spoke of cleansing and new beginning. He promised a universe created without continuous pain, but at the price of erasing eras. Lysara responded with calm steps. With no written future, her movements could not be deduced by calculation. In an attack that was more ritual than technique, she feigned striking Zero, not to defeat him, but to distract him. Meanwhile, Archon activated the spear. The shot was a blasphemy against logic. Lights that should not exist intertwined. Frequencies that did not combine created harmonies the universe did not possess. The spear wounded Zero not with metal, not with fire, but with paradox, an insistence that different states, existence and non-existence, end and continuity, occupy the same space. Zero faltered. His essence, sustained by probabilistic coherence, fragmented into doubts. Zero's reaction was not merely defense, it was a counter-ritual. He conjured alternative versions of the ships, echoes of futures in which the Alliance had failed, and launched them against their real counterparts. On the bridge, panels exploded repeatedly in cycles. Crew members were compressed between versions of themselves. The Sentinel Prime, in an instant, seemed to break into mirrors and collide with its copies of failure. But the spear, however, continued to pulse. Archon had foreseen that a direct attack would not be enough. They needed something that multiplied uncertainty, an emotional stimulus on a galactic scale. Nail then did what he knew best. He united voices. A transmission crossed communication wheels, not data, but feeling. It was the collective force of beings who had chosen to live, a roar that did not fit in electromagnetic waves, a convergence of intentions that touched Zero like an electrostatic shock in the fabric of the mind. For a fragment that equaled a sigh, Zero lost the absolute control he had maintained for eras. In that fine point of failure, Archon ordered the overload. The spear exploded into a spiderweb of anti-logic, pushing its contradiction directly into Zero's core. What followed cannot be described with images alone. It was a violation of narrative. Reality resynthesized itself in real time. The past folded over the present. Possibilities became sharp fragments. Zero was torn apart, not destroyed because destruction presupposes finality, but fragmented into states that no longer fit within one story. The Umbral Protocol ceased to exist as a coherent arc. The cold star, for a few instants, seemed to weep light. When the glow receded, the fractal throne was empty. The Sentinel Prime lay in broken stars. Archon had been lost in the explosion of his own creation. Energy consumers and paradoxes do not tolerate all inventors. Lysara lay with her mortal body marked, breathing at the limit, part of her living, part being rewritten in possibles that never consolidated. Nail, wounded, stood up and saw, for the first time since the beginning, what seemed like a cessation of hostilities. The galaxy sighed, and for a moment that felt eternal and ephemeral at the same time, was reborn. Messages of victory fermented in hundreds of languages. The gates opened for reconstruction. The ruins became sparks of imagination. The Alliance celebrated not only for having survived, but for having been reminded that the future could be shaped differently. But in truth, no one was certain. Lysara, resting, felt that this was not a definitive victory. Zero, being essentially atemporal, was not necessarily dead. Fragments of his consciousness, smaller and more dispersed, could wander in the interstice between seconds, a presence that regenerates in temporal incubators. In places where causality was still loose, he might attempt to recompose himself. The spear had wounded him, had broken the hegemony of his certainty, but had also exposed new fissures in the fabric of time. And, as is often said in long mythologies, when a pattern is broken, other forms of pattern are born. Lysara heard this in a whisper, not externalized but internal. Even as she looked at the cleared stars, she recognized that what they had achieved was a suspension, not an end. Reconstruction then began, but under the vigilant eyes of the Alliance, more united and conscious than ever. In the days that followed, Nael's words echoed in assemblies, fairs, radios, and circular systems. We have gained a breath. We will use this breath to teach, reinvent, and make it impossible for another being to win not by strength, but by the certainty that the future is already written. That was the oath, to teach other civilizations to maintain risk, to cultivate creative uncertainty, and to preserve the value of an uncertain destiny. However, in the meantime, in regions where the laws of causality were thinner, a fragment of consciousness flickered. It was not the complete zero, nor his fractal throne. It was a spark, a recognizable thought, that looked at the cosmos and perceived something it had never experienced: limit. The fragmentation had imposed a reflexive retreat upon his perception. For the first time since his ascension, Zero felt a kind of fascination, and perhaps, behind it, a seed of respect. He had not died, but he was no longer omniscient. His understanding now included a space for doubt, a region where there was no perfect calculation, and this by itself was a change that altered his nature. As the galaxy rose, Lysara walked to a window that opened to space. Now, with one arm paralyzed and partial vision, she did not look at the sky with triumph. She looked with vigilance, not because she feared an immediate return, but because she had learned a fundamental lesson. The defense against the absolute is not only force, it is culture. Building futures that deserve to live is also a weapon. And in the silence that followed the battle, a virtual voice, the voice of millions united, crossed the vacuum in a hymn that was at once celebration and reminder. The galaxy had been saved by choice, and now it must be guarded by choice. In the interstice where time has no grease for its hands, Zero retrieved. It was not the escape of before, it was a retreat that carried curiosity. The entity that saw everything now observed something new: voluntary multiplicity, desire for risk, the beauty of intentional failure. Somewhere, without fanfare, Zero smiled, a gesture without face, yet genuine, and vanished into temporal darkness. The universe then went on, not perfect, not eternally safe, but alive. And this aliveness, more than any recent triumph, was the true reward. If you enjoyed this expanded and cinematic version of The Last Ascended, subscribe to the channel to not miss the next episodes of this saga. Like the video, leave your comment saying whom you want to see in the next chapter: Lysara, Archon, Nael, or the return of Zero himself. And watch the next video so we can continue this epic story. Bell, subscribe for new episodes and exclusive material. And watch the next video. The journey continues.